afternoon to you all on behalf of the Brazil Institute and the Environmental Security, Environmental Change and Security Program here at the Wilson Center. We are both co-sponsoring this event with our good friends from George Mason University. This is, as you know, part of a series we started 2 years ago, thanks to the leadership of our dear Thomas Lovejoy, who is a professor there at George Mason, a friend of the Wilson Center, an advisor to the Brazil Institute. He is a member of our advisory board, actually. Today we are going to focus on climate change and extreme weather, impacts on public health and agriculture. We have a very distinguished group of speakers. Tom Carl, Director of the National Climate Data Center at NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Tom will speak to us remotely and will participate from the secret undisclosed location where he is right now. I think can Paul hear us? Doesn't look like it. Oops. While we fix that, I'd like also great pleasure to introduce William Hohenstein, Director of Climate Program Office at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Catherine Thomason, Executive Director of Physicians for Social Responsibility, and our dear friend Paul Schoft, who is a Professor of Climate Dynamics at George Mason, and he will be the moderator of this discussion. Before I invite the participants here to the stage and pass the buck here to Paul, I wanted to comment on a couple of announcements. This series on managing the plan is very much part of what we are doing here as Brazil Institute, as Environmental Change and Security Program. Two initiatives I wanted to share with you. On May 9th, we are going to be in Barbados with experts on water management and health issues, doing the second seminar of a series we started last February in Bogota, Colombia. It's about adaptation to climate change. It's a series of maybe 4 events this year, another 4 next year. Discussions with, those are by invitation only discussions with experts with the hope of sharing knowledge on this very new and complicated field. And in Barbados, we hope to have also a public session with the participation of senior figures of the Barbadian government and the governments of the islands around Barbados. The second initiative is something that will take place here on May the 15th, when we will host this again, the Brazil Institute and the Environmental Change and Security Program will host the governor of the state of Amapá in Brazil. Is in the extreme northeast of the Amazon region. It's one of the states very much preserved. The rainforest that is there now is mostly the same one that was there millions of years ago. So the state has, through dynamic leadership, young leadership, decided to develop a plan on green economy for the state, providing environmental services. So in order to keep the forest standing. And just a note on another initiative that we are also involved with. It started during Rio Plus 20, continued at a meeting, planning meeting at the University of São Paulo studies, which is the idea of developing the Rainforest Business School. The concept is very simple. We all know that the rainforest is worth more standing than destroyed. The problem is to add value to the forest. Some 5 years ago, one of the leading climatologists from Brazil, Carlos Nobre, came to this room, to this stage, and talked about an idea. He was then the head of the Brazilian Space Agency. He's now the principal policy person at the Ministry of Science and Technology in Brasilia. And he talked about the creation of the Institutes of Technology for the Amazon. Ideas is the main idea is to really add value to the forest, to develop activities, economic activities that will make the forest work for the people. Starting with the 25 million Brazilians that live in the Amazon, and obviously millions others that live in the Amazon in the adjacent countries, 7 other countries. We are going ahead. This is a collaboration with Brazilian institutions. This meeting in São Paulo had most people that are involved in this discussion in Brazil, very senior scientists, representatives of the NGO community, the Vice Minister of the Environment in Brazil. So we are involved in this effort. We will host one meeting here very soon, and we will keep you posted. With that, I would like to invite our speakers to come to the podium and come to the stage, and we will start then.
Thought we'd let the speakers stay here while Tom starts, and then we'll
he will manage this, so you saw what happened, okay? So it will happen exactly as Paul said. Okay, sir.
Thank you, Paulo. Welcome, everyone. I'm really excited about today's program. I've been involved in the climate science business since the late 70s, and we've seen the evolution of climate change from theory to computer model to projections to recently, actually being able to observe and document that things are really happening. And so now it's a matter of okay, things are happening, but what's it really going to look like? We're not really, so talk about a 2 degree, 3 degree, 5 degree global temperature rise. What does a global temperature rise mean for anybody? And we're now coming to a much better understanding of what that might be. We have a long ways to go. But one of the things that has emerged is that, it's not just the global mean temperature on an annual scale. It's extreme weather. It's weird weather, and all that goes with it. So today, I'm so glad that we have Tom Carl here, one of the world's leading experts on what the fabric of changing weather and extreme weather is and is showing up as. And we have Catherine Thomason here to discuss what that means for public health. There's a difference between just a slowly rising temperature and all of this extreme weather and its impact on public health. And Bill Hohenstein here from USDA to give us a perspective on how that resonates through the problems in agriculture. So without further ado, I think I'd like to invite Tom to get started on telling us about this, if we can get the presentation up and going. Thank you, Tom.
Great. Thanks, Tom. Can you hear me? what this really means in terms of impacts. And of course, money often speaks, and talk a little bit about billion-dollar disasters. And then I want to talk a little bit about the state of the science, both from a standpoint of looking at a broad spectrum of extremes, and some of the uncertainties and certainties we have related to those extremes. And then finally end with some implications here in terms of what our state of knowledge is. And I'm sorry if there isn't someone up there. I'm going to have to go on to the third slide. And oh, great, we've got someone changing it. Before I do that, I thought I'd want to tell you a little bit where a lot of this information is put together at the National Climatic Data Center. I'm here in Asheville, North Carolina. But we do have a number of federal employees around the nation. You see in a variety of states. There is about 153 of them in Asheville at headquarters that include contractors as well. About 160 federal employees. We have a number of regional climate centers we work contracts with, try and get the information out. Got a couple of cooperative institutes, one in Boulder, Colorado, and another joint institute in University of Maryland, and also in here in Asheville with North Carolina State University, and a variety of other affiliates. One of the ways in which we think about what we do, you'll see in the lower right, science, service, and stewardship. The science, trying to understand the data that comes into NOAA, either those that we collect, other agencies collect, it's collected internationally. We make sure it's safeguarded. We provide proper stewardship for that, and also providing access to that data. And you can see a picture in the bottom there. That's the building where we work here in Asheville. So just for some of you who it's kind of a haven't been here in Asheville, it might be a little bit of mystery, but that might help a little bit with the perspective. If we go to the next slide, slide 4, we'll get into the issues of economic impacts of the weather and climate extreme events that affect the U.S. So what this figure shows is for a variety of billion-dollar weather and climate disasters. This is over the period from 1980 to 2011. We've collected statistics across various federal agencies. We also work closely with private sector to try and discern what the costs of these major events are. And in this presentation, what you'll see for the upper left, for drought and heat waves, those states that are colored deepest red and those that are shaded either white or light yellow provide a range of the number of times that billion-dollar disasters affect those locations. So not surprisingly, you'll see the southeast and the middle part of the country most affected by both drought and heat waves. You can see Alaska is perfectly white, so that is an absent phenomena there. But you can see basically much of the rest of the country, certainly that is an issue. If you look to the center top, you'll see hurricanes and tropical storms. Again, the southeast affected often, but you can see some of the penetration of the storms as they move inland, make their way several thousand miles inland in some instances. Winter storms and crop freezes. Interestingly enough, the eastern half of the U.S. Is strongly affected, and what I'm looking at, it's cut off, so I'm hoping you're seeing the full figure on the far upper right. The eastern half of the U.S. Affected strongly by winter storms, and that's essentially not to say that winter storms don't affect other parts of the country, but that's where we have the vulnerability. We do have the population centers in that area, so you can see that they're heavily involved in in the winter storms, and also the crop freezes. Obviously, you have to be growing significant crops to be affected by billion-dollar events, and you will see California affected in the far west. In terms of flooding, the lower left, not surprising. You can see the major rivers, the Missouri, Mississippi, but that's not the only states that are affected by billion-dollar floods. You can see other states are affected as well. In terms of wildfires, predominantly a western half of the U.S. phenomena, particularly the Southwest, but there are a few states, Florida and North Carolina notable, that also get affected by billion-dollar disasters from wildfires. And then from the standpoint of severe local storms, you'll see, again, Tornado Alley, the central part of the country, affected by tornadoes, severe local thunderstorms. Again, the Southeast tends to be an important player. What you can see from these figures is that the entire nation of the U.S. citizenry are affected by billion-dollar disasters. You see even Alaska gets in on the wildfires. Hawaii gets in on hurricanes and tropical storms. So clearly, the nation's fairly climate conscious, and it's for good reason, not only in terms of the loss of life, but the economic hardships that these storms and events play. So on the next slide, what we tried to do in a series of expert workshops, and these have taken place over the last 2 years. There's a number of papers now. One has already appeared. Another one is getting ready to appear. The third one you'll see on the right-hand side is in the final stages of last-minute changes of appearing. And then there's one at the very bottom looking at what the models project. But all of these papers focused on what do we know about various aspects of extreme weather and climate events. And that includes, you'll see the figure, listing the kinds of phenomena that these experts looked at. Everything from extreme precipitation events, heat waves, cold waves, floods, droughts, extreme extratropical cyclones, winds, ocean waves, snowstorms, hurricanes, hail, tornadoes, thunderstorm winds, ice storms, essentially all those events that you saw on the previous page that have major economic impacts in terms of billion-dollar disasters in the U.S. And the figure shows what we were able to discern from all these experts in terms of where we think our knowledge about our ability to discern changes, that is, detect changes on a multi-decadal time scale of the phenomena in question. And you'll see some phenomena we think we have more knowledge, and other phenomena we have less knowledge. So, for example, our ability to detect changes in the frequency and intensity of heat waves and cold waves is in the upper right. But if you look at thunderstorm-induced damaging winds, ice storms, our ability to detect changes in the frequency of those events across decades is, we feel we have less knowledge as comparison to those other events I just mentioned. What you'll see in this diagram, which came out after the discussion, so it was not predisposed that you would be able to see this. If you look at the upper right, there is better capability of being able to detect changes corresponds with an increased ability to understand the cause of the changes. So you'll see for extreme precipitation events, heat waves, cold waves, we believe we have more knowledge in our ability to understand, well, what is the real cause of any changes we see. And you'll see in the lower left, not only can we not detect very good multi-decadal changes, we feel we don't have a good understanding of what the causative factors may be in those changes. So not surprisingly, there is a relationship between better capability in terms of observing leads to better capabilities in our ability to understanding. Now, it's not a one-to-one match, obviously, and you can see for extreme extratropical cyclones, we think we now have the capability to monitor multi-decadal changes with some skill, but we feel that our ability to explain why we're seeing the changes isn't quite as good as we have for some of the other phenomena. So it is a significant correlation, but it's not perfect by any stretch. So what I'd like for you to take away from this is that when you hear discussions from scientists about these phenomena and what may be attributable to their changes over time, keep in mind that for some of these phenomena, we're going to be a little more capable in explaining those causes and changes, and for others, we'll be less capable. So if I go on to the next figure, what this figure attempts to do is to take a look at something called a U.S. Climate Extremes Index, where we have incorporated various measures of changes in extremes, particularly where we have some confidence in our ability to detect multi-decadal changes, as we just discussed on the previous page. And this measure of extremes in this index includes, you see in the upper right, extremes of wetness and drought, extremes of heavy one-day precipitation event, consecutive dry and wet days, extremes of temperature, both maximum and minimum temperature across the country, hurricanes, the intensity and the frequency at which they strike landfall, and that's important to keep in mind, landfall. And you can see, if you actually look at this index over the course of the 20th century and into the 21st century, you'll see in the middle part of the 20th century, particularly in the 60s and early 70s, we had what some might call a climate optimal in the U.S., fewer extremes than earlier in the 20th century. But more recently, especially since about 1965, 70, we've seen a significant uptick in the frequency of extreme weather and climate events captured by this index, and we'll talk about what portions of this index are really driving that increase. But I can tell you, overall, if you go back to 1910 to 2012, there is no significant change in terms of statistical significance if you look for a unidirectional trend. But if you actually do the statistics and look for change points, you'll find that since the late 60s, there is a significant increase in extreme events affecting the U.S. So that's important to keep in mind, because when you look at the billion-dollar disasters, that time series also shows an increase, and there's been a lot of debate as to whether that's caused by weather and climate extremes, or is it more things are in harm's way, more things to be affected. It's probably a combination of both, given the fact that we do see this extreme index increasing significantly since the late 60s. So we go to the next slide. The question then is, well, what are those factors that are contributing to that increase? And these four factors are really the so-called culprits. You'll see in the top two panels extremes in maximum temperature and extremes in minimum temperature. You can look at this diagram and interpret it as the percent of the U.S. affected by much above or much below normal temperatures. The red meaning much above normal, the blue much below normal. And you'll notice for both the maximum and the minimum, an absence of much below normal temperatures over the last couple of decades. So what's really driving that increase in extremes index from the temperature perspective is the very high temperatures, and it's pretty obvious. 2012, for the maximum temperature, percent of the country much above normal for the year 2012, higher than other year we've seen. If you look at the minimum temperature, you'll see it's comparable to what we saw maybe about 15 years ago. That was 1998 when we had the strong El Nino. We had a lot of clouds and rain. The minimums were highly elevated. If you take a look at the bottom two panels, other factors that are helping to drive the increase, the combination of either too much water or too little water over the last few decades has also tended to drive the index up, albeit there are times back in the 30s and 50s where we had extensive drought areas where the index was quite high. More recently, this index is high both because of drought areas and too many wet areas. And then lastly, in the lower right, you'll see extremes and one-day heavy precipitation events, particularly the last few decades, clearly far above anything we've seen in the 20th century. Now, again, some of these we feel that we've got a better understanding as to why. With the extremes and one-day heavy precipitation event, probably that's one where we think we've got a better handle than the rest, and I'll go into that in a minute. We go on to the next slide. We can break down the heat wave and cold wave frequency. It's a little different look. This is heat waves and cold waves defined by a 4-day episode. And if you look at it from that standpoint by decade, these are standardized, this is a standardized index. And you look at it by region, you can see that, of course, not every region is behaving similarly. And I'll just point out, if you look at the Southwest, the frequency of heat waves going up significantly by the reds in the last couple of decades, cold waves going down significantly, also an absence of them in the last few decades. And you could contrast that to areas like the Midwest, where it's hard to discern a significant change, particularly if you look at the frequency of heat waves from this index. The 30s really stand out, and you can see by decade the heat wave frequency is not nearly as strong as it was in the 30s. Cold waves decreasing the last decade, although they were fairly significant in the 60s and 70s. If we take a look at the U.S. as a whole, that's the lower left. Based on this index, you do see an increase in the frequency of heat waves, but not as strong as what we saw in the 30s. That was a whole decade of heat. So this often can be quite confusing to people saying, well, we've heard one climatologist or meteorologist say there's no change in heat wave frequency or intensity. Another one says there is, walking away, shoulder shrug, not knowing what to believe. The reality is it depends on kind of the index you take a look at. This index is very short episodic heat waves, 4-day events, 4-day cold waves. The previous slide we were showing was looking at much above normal temperatures across months. So if you look over different time horizons, you can get different results. It's important to keep that in mind because they have different impacts. So I think I can tell you for prolonged heat that lasts months or more, we're now in an area where we haven't charted before. If you're looking at episodic events of short days, 4-day events, 3-day events, we still haven't surpassed what we saw in the 30s. We go on to the next slide. The next slide is what I mentioned earlier, these heavy precipitation events. The heavy precipitation events have been linked. In fact, a nice paper just was published here recently, Kunkel et al., showing how these events are closely coupled with increases in water vapor. That is, at the time of extreme precipitation events, we know as the atmosphere warms up, it's able to hold more water. We're showing an increase in water vapor at the time of these events. So a strong indication that the increases in water vapor are really what's driving these increases in heavy precipitation events. Now, you clearly have to have the dynamics, the storm systems have to be there, the instability has to be there. Once you have that, when you do have more moisture in the atmosphere, you tend to get heavier precipitation events. Now, on the next slide, if we go on to the next one, again, another potential point of confusion. If you look at the left figure shows in triangles those areas that have positive trends in significant flooding along rivers. These are stream flow rivers. And you can see in the upper Midwest a lot of green triangles pointing upward, but you'll see in other areas, the Southwest, triangles that are orange pointing downward, the Northeast, some triangles pointing upward, and kind of a mixed bag. Those floods relate quite nicely, the patterns, to the trends in the total annual precipitation. So there, it's the amount of precipitation that accumulates over the course of the year that leads to the floods along the rivers. And so, again, here's a case where you have to be very careful, because you can have some people claiming we don't see an increase in flooding, remembering that rivers tend to flood at different times across the country. In the Midwest, much of the flooding is in the spring. What we saw in the previous diagram was extremes in one-day heavy precipitation events, and that is best reflected in the warm season months. So if you're getting very heavy downpours in August and September and July, when streams are normally low, that's going to lead to more urban flooding or localized flooding as opposed to these big river floods. So that's another important point to keep in mind when you hear people talk about whether floods and heavy precipitation are going up or down. The next picture shows the changes in drought frequency. This is the percent of drought across the U.S. You can see again 1936, 34 stands out. Percent of the U.S. In moderate to extreme drought. You can see what happened last year. We had a peak, wasn't as strong as it was in 36. But the point of this diagram, if you just talk from this index, you could convince yourself that you've got less droughts nationwide. If you start in the 30s, you start in the 70s, you'd say, well, droughts are increasing in frequency. You can see that dashed dotted trend line. And again, this is nationwide. You're going to get different results depending on a region you look at. If you look at the Southwest, you'll see droughts now are as strong as we've ever seen in the record. And again, a combination here for droughts, both precipitation and the amount of evapotranspiration contributes. So as temperatures warm, tending to be more evapotranspiration. One also has to consider changes in cloud cover and changes in wind speed, because they also contribute to the evapotranspiration. The next picture shows changes in extreme snowstorms. The question here is, would changes in temperature and precipitation in a warmer world favor fewer extreme snowstorms? So what we did is we took a look at the top 50 snowstorms in each of the regions you see labeled in the two slides. The top and bottom one, Northeast, Ohio Valley, Upper Midwest, Northern Plains, Southeast, and Southern Plains. And you can see what we've done is historically looked at when we had these extreme snowstorms, were they more frequent when we had a cooler or warmer cold season? And you see encircled there, in some areas, there's a distinct difference between warmer than normal conditions or colder than normal conditions. So the Southern Plains, perhaps not surprisingly, when it's colder than normal cold season, a lot more probability of extreme snow events. Overall, if you look at other areas, however, like the Northern Plains, you see the difference between very cold winters and warmer winters not nearly as significant, and in fact, the differences are not statistically significant. So one has to keep in mind where you are in the nation to understand whether or not you're going to have more snowstorms or fewer extreme snowstorms as the temperatures continue to warm. The bottom panel looks at the same kind of a breakout, only now for wetter and drier conditions. And there you see in the northern plains, it's not so much the temperature that's driving the extreme snowstorms, but it's whether or not you've got a wet or dry year. The wetter years tend to have more extreme snowstorms than the dry years. And so the next step, obviously, to look at is, well, what are the projections for the future? So obviously it's going to warm up in the northern plains, but one other area where there is some confidence, and that is during the cold season, things would be wetter in the northern plains. And so you might then conclude that even as we go into the 21st century, don't discount the significant probability of extreme snowstorms. Even during warmer times with more precipitation, they're still likely. And there's a paper that's about to be submitted on this, talking about a lot of these conditional probabilities. And going on to the next slide, talk a little bit about tornadoes and convective storms. Wanted to show you this diagram. This is an example of the difficulties we have in discerning changes in tornadoes. These are tracking tornadoes of F1 and greater. That's, the intensity scale and the Fujita scale going from F0 to F5. For the F1 and greater storms, you can see these different colors here reflect times at which there was different ways of observing tornadoes that were introduced. And there's obviously some strong suggestions that there's some biases in these numbers. We've looked at the track length of these tornadoes. They show the same kind of tendencies. Done a number of statistical significance tests. It looks like you're probably safe looking at these changes since the early 70s, but you have to discount the data prior to that time, and the jury is still out on the most recent change in terms of the enhanced Fujita scale in terms of a tornado observing system. Fact is, we do not have as a nation a very good objective means of tracking tornadoes. We do this through a lot of surveys, a lot of people going out, trying to see where a tornado had occurred, but we don't have another backup yet, although we may hopefully in the future, like we do with hurricanes. We've got objective satellite estimates in addition to airplanes going out and observations being made. We think there might be some things we can do with satellites, looking at tornado tracks through some of the high-resolution satellite data. So the last slide, I just want to end up with a summary. Bottom line here, we have widely varying suitability of our data. This affects our physical understanding, and I think it's important to keep in mind, particularly if you're looking for how we can improve in the future, there is this positive relationship between better ability to observe and a better ability to understand these events. So with that, I'll turn it back over to the moderator. Thanks.